Imagine a small gray room. A federal agent slides a recorder across a steel table and presses play. And the voice that comes out, calm, certain, talking about a stock days before the news breaks, is yours. There is no arguing with it. There is no explaining it away. It is simply you on tape, in your own words. This film is the story of the first time the untouchables of Wall Street heard that sound. For a long time, almost everyone on Wall Street believed the same quiet thing. That at the very top, the game was rigged. That a small handful of people always seemed to know about the merger, the bad quarter, the secret deal, a day or an hour before the rest of the world. You could see it in the timing of the trades. You could feel it in your gut. You just could never, ever prove it. The man at the center of this story ran a hedge fund called Galleon. At its peak, it managed about $7 billion. He was a billionaire. He was charming, brilliant, generous to his friends, and by every measure the world uses, he was untouchable. Here is what you need to know before we begin. He was not caught by a paper trail, or a clever accountant, or a jealous rival. He was caught the way the government catches mobsters and drug cartels. They listened. They recorded his phone. Then in a courtroom, they played him back to himself. So the question of this film is not whether the rich cheat. You already suspect that they do. The real question is harder, and it is more interesting. What does it actually take to catch one of them? And what did the people chasing him have to become to finally make it stick? Now hold one more image next to the billionaire. On the other side of his trade sits someone completely ordinary, a retired teacher, a nurse moving her savings into the market, a young couple buying their first shares of a company they believe in. They are playing what they think is a fair game, and they have no idea that the game is not fair. That is the real injury at the center of this story. Not a vault broken open in the night, but a market tilted in broad daylight, one secret at a time, against every single person who actually followed the rules. To understand why this case shook the entire industry, you have to understand one word. The word runs the whole street. Edge. On Wall Street, an edge is the thing you know that the person on the other side of the trade does not. Better research, faster math, a sharper read of the crowd. A legal edge is the engine of the entire business. Every fund, every desk, every analyst is hunting for one. Every single hour the market is open. Raj Rajaratnam was very, very good at the legal kind. He was relentless on the phone. He built a vast web of contacts across the technology and finance worlds, and he worked it constantly, trading gossip, favors, and reads on companies. He turned Galleon into one of the most watched funds of its era, and the returns made him rich and made the people around him rich. Proximity to him felt like proximity to money. To the people who worked for him, Rajaratnam could seem like the best connected man alive. He ran the fund like a newsroom that never went to sleep, pulling in fragments from everywhere, rewarding whoever brought him something sharp, and never quite forgetting whoever showed up empty-handed. Inside that world, knowing things was the entire game. The earlier you knew, the bigger you were. Most of what reached him was ordinary and completely legal, the daily weather of a busy fund. This story is only about the part that was not. But there is a second kind of edge, and it does not come from working harder than anyone else. It comes from knowing first. Knowing the earnings before they are announced. Knowing the takeover before it is signed. Knowing the bad news while everyone else is still being told the company is fine. That kind of edge is not research, it is theft. Information that belongs to a company and its shareholders, not to a trader with the right friends. And that second edge has one beautiful, terrible feature. It almost never leaves a mark. A normal crime gives you something to point at. A body, a broken window, a missing car. This crime is a single sentence whispered into a telephone. A number traded for a number. And then a trade that looks, on paper, exactly like a smart guess by a man already famous for smart guesses. So ask yourself the question the government could not answer for decades. How do you prove a whisper? For most of the history of the market, the honest answer was that you mostly couldn't. Regulators could see the suspicious trade. They could see that someone bought heavily, right before the good news and sold right before the bad. But seeing a pattern is not the same as proving that a specific human being knew a specific secret. A suspicious chart is a hunch, and you cannot send a person to prison on a hunch. A jury needs the moment the secret actually changed hands, and that moment was always invisible. Sit with what that meant for a second, because it is the quiet engine of the whole problem. It meant the people most able to cheat were also the people hardest to catch. The bigger and more powerful your network, the more deniable any single phone call became. You could always say it was a guess. You could always say it was research, a mosaic of public facts assembled by a brilliant mind. The edge protected itself. The better you were at it, the safer you were. So, a culture grew up inside that blind spot. Not everyone. Most of Wall Street is honest, and most edges really are earned. But at the very top, among a small set of people who all knew one another, a different habit took hold. Information became a kind of currency. You gave a secret, and you got one back. Favors with a price measured not in dollars but in tips, and the tips were worth millions. And the currency moved through ordinary friendship, which is what made it so hard to see. A college classmate who now sat on a corporate board, a consultant who advised everyone and therefore heard everything, an executive flattered to be asked his opinion by a famous investor. None of them on a normal Tuesday looked anything like a criminal. They looked like a contact list. That was the genius of the thing. That was also the rot of it. Rajaratnam sat in the middle of a web exactly like that. The government would later argue that it ran from inside a giant chip company in the West, through one of the most famous consulting firms in the world, and all the way into the boardroom of one of the most powerful banks on earth. Secrets came in along those lines. Trades went out, and the fund kept beating the market just often enough, and just quietly enough, to look like pure genius instead of something else. For years, that was as close to a perfect crime as money can buy. It was quiet, it was wildly profitable, and it was deniable at every single step. It was the kind of thing that everyone in the business suspected was happening, and that no prosecutor on earth could actually touch. If the story had simply stayed there, in that comfortable shadow, you would never have heard this man's name. This matters to you even if you have never bought a single share in your life. Your pension owns stocks. Your retirement account owns stocks. The savings of almost everyone you know are quietly riding on one promise: that the market is roughly fair, that nobody at the table can simply see the cards. When a handful of insiders can see them, the market stops being a market. It becomes a private club with a public entrance, and the rest of us are standing in that entrance, paying full price for a seat in a game that was already decided. But somewhere inside the government, a small group of investigators got tired of it, tired of watching the pattern light up again and again, and never being able to reach the people behind it. They had the trades, they had the timing, they had the suspicion. What they did not have was the one thing a jury believes more than any chart, more than any expert, more than any theory. They did not have the words. So they decided to go and get them. And to do it, they reached for a tool that, until that moment, no one in the country had ever really aimed at a man in a good suit. To see how the secrets actually traveled, follow 4 people. None of them ran a hedge fund. Each of them simply sat somewhere a fund manager can only dream of sitting, inside the company before the news. Each was charged separately in their own case, with their own story and their own fate. But the lines they sat on all ran eventually toward the same telephone. The first sat inside Intel, one of the largest chip makers on earth. A man named Rajiv Goyal, a friend of Rajaratnam's going back years. From a seat like that, you can see a quarter before the public can. You can know whether the numbers are going to be good or bad, while the rest of the market is still guessing, still hoping, still trading in the dark. The second sat at McKinsey, the consulting firm that quietly advises the giants of the corporate world. A partner named Anil Kumar. The government said he was paid on the side for a private stream of the things he learned while advising his clients. The entire promise of a firm like that is discretion, that your secrets are safe in the room. That promise, prosecutors said, was quietly for sale. The third sat high inside IBM. Robert Moffat, a senior executive, the kind of name that gets floated as a future chief of the whole company. And the fourth, Danielle Chiesi, worked at a fund called Newcastle and traded in the same kind of secrets. Talking, the government said, in the careful half code of people who know, somewhere inside, that they should not be saying this out loud. Look at that group for 1 second. An Intel insider, a McKinsey partner, an IBM executive, a fund manager. This was not some back alley. This was the boardroom, the corner office, and the consulting suite. The respectable rooms, the ones with the good art and the city views. And inside those rooms, the government would argue, the market that millions of ordinary people trusted with their savings was being quietly, methodically robbed. Look again at exactly where these people sat. A great chip company, a legendary consulting firm, a pillar of American business, institutions that run entirely on trust, on the simple belief that what happens inside their walls stays inside their walls. The government's case was that each of these places had been quietly hollowed out a little from the inside, by someone they had trusted with their most guarded secrets. The robbery here was not only of the market, it was of the institutions themselves, betrayed by the very people they had lifted to the top. Here is how a single secret turned into money. An insider learns that a company is about to be bought. He picks up the phone. Minutes later, a fund is buying that stock, quietly, in pieces, spread out so that nothing looks strange to anyone watching. Days later, the deal is announced to the public. The price jumps. The position that was bought on a whisper is suddenly worth millions more than it cost. Clean, invisible. Worst of all, repeatable. The quiet genius of a network like this is that nobody inside it ever has to feel like a criminal. The insider is only helping a friend. The friend is only listening. The favor comes wrapped in dinners, in shared vacations, in years of real trust until the precise moment a secret crosses the line is almost impossible to find. There is no mask. There is no getaway car. There is no single dramatic betrayal. There is just a relationship, slowly bent, one ordinary conversation at a time, until the bending quietly becomes the whole point of the friendship. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The people feeding those secrets were not, for the most part, desperate. They were not stealing to survive. They were already successful, already wealthy, already admired. The temptation at the top of the world is not survival, it is certainty. It is the chance to take the one thing the market is never ever supposed to sell, a sure thing, and to feel, just for a moment, like a person who simply cannot lose. What did all of this actually earn? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on how you count it. Different agencies used different methods and arrived at different numbers, and we will come back to that gap later, because the gap itself turns out to be part of the story. But by any reasonable count, the trades that ran on these whispers were worth tens of millions of dollars. Now remember the problem from the first movement. Every one of these calls sounded, to anyone listening from the outside, like two friends simply talking. Markets, the weather, family. A name dropped here, a number mentioned there. Nothing a regulator could ever carry into a courtroom and hand to a jury. The crime lived entirely in the timing, and the timing was perfectly, infuriatingly deniable. The man at the center of it understood that completely. It is a large part of why people at his level felt so safe. They were not hiding in some dark and obvious place. They were hiding in plain sight, inside conversations that looked and sounded completely ordinary, protected by one simple and seemingly permanent fact. No one could hear them. No one could hear them. That sentence is the hinge of the entire story, so hold on to it. The crime was perfect for exactly as long as it stayed unheard, which meant there was really only one way left to break it. Someone was going to have to start listening. The investigators who finally moved on, Galleon came at it the slow way, the patient way. They started where these cases usually start, with someone on the inside who agreed to cooperate, a person who could tell them where to look and confirm what the trades had only ever hinted at. But a cooperator can always be doubted. A good defense lawyer can stand in front of a jury and say, This person is a liar. This person is only talking to save their own skin. Do not believe a word of it. The investigators wanted something a defense lawyer could not talk their way around. They wanted evidence that could not be cross-examined into doubt. They wanted the calls themselves. So they did something that, in a financial case, was almost unheard of. They went to a federal judge, laid out what they had, and asked for a wiretap. Court permission to secretly record a private citizen's telephone. For decades, that specific power had been pointed at organized crime, at drug networks, at the kind of violence that leaves actual bodies in the street. It had not been pointed at a billionaire sitting behind a Bloomberg terminal. Understand how large a line that was to cross. A wiretap is the most invasive tool the government has. It does not capture one careful, chosen moment. It captures everything, every deal, every secret, every private, foolish, ordinary, human thing a person says into a phone across the span of months. To aim that tool at Wall Street was to declare something new and stunning out loud. The suits would now be treated exactly like the mob. The judge said yes, and in 2008, on Raj Rajaratnam's phone, the recorders began to turn. For months, federal agents sat in a quiet room and listened to a billionaire's life unfold, one call at a time. Most of it was nothing. Lunch plans, complaints, the grind of an ordinary rich man's day. They waited patiently for the ordinary chatter to harden into something a jury would understand. Consider the people in that listening room for a moment. Night after night, headphones on, transcribing a stranger's entire life, the dinner plans, the arguments, the long stretches of pure boredom. Most of it meant absolutely nothing, and sitting through all of that, nothing was the actual job. They were waiting for a single sentence, the one moment when a careful man finally forgot to be careful and said out loud the thing the trades had only ever whispered. Patience, it turned out, was the one weapon the men at the top had never planned for. Eventually it did, because here is the strange truth about feeling untouchable. The longer it lasts, the less careful you become. On a tapped line, the government would later say, the scheme stopped being an abstract pattern of trades and became a plain conversation. People discussed information they were never supposed to have. They discussed it directly, in their own voices, with their own names attached, into a phone they were absolutely certain was private. That is the moment the whole world quietly tilts. For the entire history of this kind of crime, the secret had been invisible, untouchable, impossible to hold in your hand. Now it was on tape. The whisper had a waveform. The deniable phone call had become a recording, time-stamped in the speaker's own unmistakable voice, sitting in a government evidence locker, waiting. And you cannot tell a jury that a recording is only guessing. You cannot say the tape was confused or jealous or just assembling a clever mosaic of public facts. The defense that had protected the very top of Wall Street for generations, the comfortable line that it was only talk, only research, simply does not survive the sound of your own voice, calmly saying otherwise. There is something uncomfortable in all of this, and the honest version of the story has to admit it. A government that can listen to a billionaire can, in principle, listen to anyone. The very same tool that finally caught the guilty could just as easily be turned to frighten the innocent. The question waiting at the end of this case was never only whether one man had done it, it was whether a free country should hand itself a power this large and then trust that it would only ever be pointed at the people who truly deserved it. On the morning of October 16, 2009, it ended the way these things end in the movies, except that it was completely real. Agents came to the door. They arrested Raj Rajaratnam at his home and walked him out. A billionaire in handcuffs in front of the cameras on the morning news. That same day, federal prosecutors and the SEC stepped up to the microphones and announced the charges. The image went around the world that morning. A man who had spent his whole life as the person everyone else called for answers was now the person being walked to a car. For everyone who had ever quietly suspected the game was rigged and assumed nothing would ever actually be done about it, that single picture said something simple and almost unbelievable. Sometimes the people at the very top do get the knock on the door. Within days, the $7 billion fund began to close down. The contacts stopped returning calls. The empire that had taken years to build came apart in a matter of weeks, because the one thing that had truly held it all together had never been the trades. It had been the silence, and that silence was over. But an arrest is not a conviction, and Raj Rajaratnam did not fold. He hired one of the finest defense teams that money can buy, and then he made a choice that most people in his position never make. He refused to plead guilty. He decided to take the whole thing to a jury, and he bet everything that the tapes would not be enough. The trial opened in Manhattan in 2011, and more than anything else, it turned on sound. The prosecutors did not simply stand up and describe the scheme in their own words. They played it. They sat the jury down, and they let 12 ordinary people listen to the defendant's own recorded phone calls. Again and again, until the abstract, bloodless idea of insider trading became something else entirely. A human voice filling a silent courtroom. The defense did everything it possibly could. It argued the trades were built on research, on public information, on the ordinary mosaic of facts that any sharp analyst assembles every day. For years, in case after case, that argument had worked. It had been the great escape hatch at the top of the market. But it is very, very hard to talk over a recording. The jury did not have to imagine the crime. They could hear it. The defense even had a name for its argument: the mosaic theory. The idea that a brilliant analyst builds a picture out of 1,000 small, public, perfectly legal pieces, the way a mosaic is built from tiles, and that what looks from the outside like a stolen secret is really just an unusually good guess. For years, that picture had been almost impossible to take apart. It was the perfect defense for an invisible crime. The trouble this time was simple. The tapes did not show a mosaic. They showed a phone call. On May 11th, 2011, the jury came back guilty, and not on a few of the counts, as a kind of split decision. On all 14, 5 counts of conspiracy, 9 counts of securities fraud. The man that everyone in the business had called untouchable had just been convicted in open court by 12 completely ordinary people who had spent weeks doing nothing but listening to him. When the foreman said the word guilty 14 times over, something cracked in that room that was far bigger than one man. For a whole generation, the people at the very top had operated on a kind of unspoken promise that the rules quietly bent for them, that the worst thing that could ever really happen was a fine, a settlement, an uncomfortable week in the newspapers. A billionaire in a federal prison cell was never part of that deal. The verdict tore the promise up in public, where everyone in every corner office could see it. 5 months later, on October the 13th, 2011, the sentence came down: 11 years in federal prison. At the time, prosecutors called it the longest prison sentence ever handed down in an American insider trading case. The number was not just a punishment for one man, it was a message, fired down the entire length of Wall Street, meant to be heard in every corner office in the country. Then came the money. The court ordered him to forfeit more than $53 million and to pay a $10 million fine on top of it. And in a separate civil case, the SEC won a record penalty of more than $92 million, the largest it had ever obtained against a single individual in an insider trading case. Add it all together, and the penalties against him passed $156 million. Now finally come back to that gap in the profit numbers. Depending on who was counting and how, the illegal gains were put at anywhere from $20-odd million to over 60. We do not actually need one clean, final figure, and you should be suspicious of anyone who hands you one. The court's own number, the more than $50 million he was forced to give back, already says everything it needs to say. The case did not stop with one man. Regulators eventually brought civil charges against 29 people and firms across the wider Galleon investigation, and the broader sweep ended in dozens of convictions and guilty pleas. The Whisper network, it turned out, had a great many nodes. This was never the story of a single bad apple. It was the story of an orchard. And one of those lines reached as high as the case would ever go. In a completely separate trial with its own jury, a former Goldman Sachs board member named Rajat Gupta was convicted in 2012 of feeding Rajaratnam secrets from inside one of the most powerful banks in the world. He was sentenced to 2 years. His was a different case, a different verdict, a different punishment. But it answered the oldest, most cynical question about Wall Street. Did the rot reach all the way to the very top? Yes, it did. Rajaratnam's lawyers appealed, and they aimed straight at the heart of the case: the wiretaps. If the recordings could be thrown out, then everything built upon them might collapse with them. This was the real test. Not whether he had done it, the jury had answered that, but whether the government had ever been allowed to listen in the first place. In 2013, the appeals court gave its answer. It upheld the wiretaps as lawfully authorized. It ruled that the recordings could stand, and it affirmed the conviction. The method was now blessed by the courts. Listening to Wall Street the same way you listen to the mob was, the judges said, entirely legal. A door that had been shut for a century had been opened, and it was not going to close again. Raj Rajaratnam served most of his term. In 2019, he was released to home confinement. He has never accepted the verdict. In a memoir, he still insists that he was wronged. A research-driven trader, he says, caught in a net that was cast far too wide. You are allowed to hear that. To be fair, you should. But the appeals court heard it too, and it disagreed, and the conviction stands today exactly as the jury delivered it. So, go back to the question we opened with. Not whether the rich cheat. You never doubted that. The question was what it actually takes to catch one. Now you have the answer. It took the government deciding to treat a billionaire like a gangster. It took a judge's signature granting permission to listen. And in the end, it took the one piece of evidence that even the most powerful man in the room cannot argue with, himself. That is why this case still matters all these years later. Not because one more fund manager went to prison, but because of the day the most protected people in the country learned that the line had quietly moved, that the old defense, the easy claim that it was only talk, could now be recorded and frozen and played back in their own calm voice to 12 strangers in a jury box. The whisper was no longer safe, and everyone at the top knew it. Most stories about Wall Street end with a shrug, because most of them end with no one really paying. A fine that costs less than the crime, a settlement with no admission of anything, a famous name that is quietly back in business by spring. This one ends differently, and that difference is the entire reason to tell it. A man at the very top was caught, convicted, and sent to prison on the strength of nothing more than his own recorded voice. The system is not really built to do that to its most powerful people. Once, against the odds, it did. The system does not catch the people at the very top very often. This is the story of one of the times that it did. If that matters to you, if you want more stories about how the powerful are finally held to account, told straight and told carefully, then subscribe to the channel and hit the like button below so that the next one finds its way to you. Stay curious, and we will see you in the next one.